Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This is Season 3 of the Educational Physics Podcast. I hope to speak about many issues. I hope to speak to guests about many issues. And I hope that we together can discuss the future of education in an honest and open way. Please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. Today, I want to introduce you to a topic that I find fascinating, which is brain-based education. Let's first define this. Brain-based education is a school of thought when it comes to obviously delivering education, which takes into account the way the brain works. Rather than just thinking about curriculum and what we should be talking about, the delivery is then framed according to how the human brain operates. Now, there are several different principles as to how brain-based education operates, okay? Today's episode will be a description and a breakdown with a couple of examples for those 12 principles. In future episodes, we'll then go even further into this, or even deeper, and discuss the role of genetics. Is intelligent a nature or nurture sort of issue? We'll talk about the role of epigenetics, and we'll have some fun exploring these ideas and how this correlates to education in schools or in informal settings like we spoke about last week. Let's then talk about the 12 principles of brain-based education. Principle number 1 is that the brain is unique. The way each human brain works and is wired is pretty one in infinite. Now, of course, anatomically speaking, we pretty much all share the same physiology of a brain. We have our frontal lobe, which takes care of planning, movement, personality development, etc., etc. We have our parietal lobe, which takes care of perception, language, touch. So it identifies or manages our tactile sense. We have our temporal lobe, which processes auditory information. So if you are more of a oral sort of learner, that means that your temporal lobe gets activated first. We have the occipital lobe, which analyzes visual information, and so on and so forth. Now, what's important here to understand is that even though the anatomy of the brain might be very similar, if not the same, amongst all humans, the way the brain then works within those different sections of the brain is quite unique. That's principle number 1. So, for instance, a visual learner, someone who learns best by watching others do something, is someone who obviously engages with certain parts of their body or their brain rather first, meaning the synapses that are fired and triggered by the stimuli, which is the visual stimuli, trigger that part of the brain before any others. Now, that doesn't mean that the other parts of the brain are not triggered as well. It's just an issue of sequence, right? Where do the electric signals go and in which order? That's really all it means. And it's important that we understand this. When we speak about a visual learner, we're not talking about someone who cannot learn by other means. Of course they can, and that can be developed over time and it can be learned. It only means that in the sequence of events is visual first, and then the other processing models, auditory or spoken word, written word, etc., etc. Let's address principle number 2. A threatening environment is not conducive to great learning. Now, this might sound obvious, because why would you threaten someone to learn something? But if you think about perhaps a more old school style, we hope at least, the reality is that a lot of teachers would pressure their students to learn on the basis of threat. There was a threat of punishment, a threat of discipline. Even to this day, that threat might not be physical, but it's still there, right? There's an implied threat that the students might fail, that the students might get in trouble, might get told off, etc., etc. And parents likewise, right? Parents who are demanding of their kids often will create an environment of fear around learning. Now, that is not conducive to learning. Let's think about this from the perspective of brain-based education. When you are under the pressure of threat, or under the implication of threat, your brain is reacting with what we would call the lizard brain, right? Your amygdala gets activated, which is your fight or flight part of your brain, right? Where you make that decision: do I fight, do I flee, or do I freeze, which can also be an option. It is important that we then understand how to combat this in our teaching life. Well, for you to motivate someone to learn, and for you to allow their brains to process the information efficiently and effectively, you have to allow for creativity, time, space, autonomy, which is empowering. And you have to allow for and provide even safe space. And I'm not saying this in that mainstream way that people use the word safe space. I'm literally saying safe space, or a safe place, a safe environment, however you want to say it. So we're not using buzzwords. And that leads us to our principle number 3, which is emotions are critical to learning. Again, from a neurological standpoint, think about what sounds more conducive to learning. Are you discharging adrenaline and you're getting more and more stressed? Or would you prioritize or at least prefer to release dopamine, which is a positive neurochemical, and associate the dopamine release to learning? Obviously, in the long run, the release of dopamine in the context of learning will become its own positive reinforcement mechanism, if you will, that we have in our brains. Negative reinforcement, adrenaline discharge. Positive reinforcement, dopamine discharge. So what would you prefer to associate to learning? So emotions are absolutely crucial. They drive our attention, your health in general, how you feel, will condition your memory. People who are depressed, for example, they have severe memory problems, right? They struggle to remember things, especially short-term memory. And that's not a coincidence. That is the way the brain works. Those neurochemicals will affect the synapses that you can create. Information, this is principle number 4. Information is stored and retrieved through multiple neural pathways. Okay, so the brain, the way the brain works, as most of us know, is through electrical synapses, or synapses, however you want to pronounce that. And those connect information, okay, between neurons and chunks of neurons and sections of the brain, that those connections are then accessed whenever that same problem or similar problems arise in your life. And that's what we call muscle memory, for example, is a perfect example of this, right? You memorize a certain movement, which can be as simple as walking, right? When you're born, you can't walk, you learn how to walk. The reason why toddlers struggle to walk at first is because, or why they trip over themselves, is because they haven't really memorized the pattern of right, left. So they often go right, left, right, and bam, they trip. That's a misfired synapse, right? As they learn through tripping over, actually, they know that they don't want to fall over, and so they learn and they keep on rewiring those synapses correctly to acquire the muscle memory that will allow them to walk and then run and do what you and I do every day, which is to just walk around. It feels very normal now, doesn't it? You can walk around and speak on the phone and play games, and muscle memory is a fascinating example of synapses that are wired and then they get triggered together, wired together, triggered together, right? So it is important to understand that these synapses are wired constantly, which, by the way, brings us to something that is very important, which is we have to be very careful with how we communicate information, because muscle memory does not care, or any kind of memory, does not care for whether the thing you're learning or memorizing is positive or negative. Okay, I'll give you a very simple example. Muscle memory does not care whether the movement you're learning is correct or incorrect. Whatever you repeat sticks. Okay, so like the saying, practice makes perfect, is absolute nonsense. Practice in itself does not make perfect. If you practice the wrong movement, say you're trying to learn a dance routine, if you practice the wrong choreography for a year later, it's not going to suddenly click and be perfect. So practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And let's forget the word perfect as being, or I don't mean let's forget, I mean let's acknowledge that the word perfect is quite imperfect. But moving on. Number 5. All learning is a relationship between the mind and the body. So if you add physical stimuli to an intellectual pursuit of any kind, you're trying to learn about maths, let's say. If you add a physical aspect to it, or specific sensorial stimuli, it will facilitate the memorization and the understanding of those concepts much, much quicker. I saw a study years ago where they showed that you could connect certain data or let's say facts like dates or historical names or whatever, and you could connect them to certain parts of your body. So you could think blue, yellow, and red, right? That's your elbow. So then if you need to recall that, blah, blah, blah is, and you can remember the color, if you were to pinch your earlobe, you remember blue, yellow, red. Right? So this is a very silly example of how you can associate verbal memories to physical stimuli, right? Your nose, your earlobe, whatever. And it is important to understand, once again, that in the teaching process, we can incorporate those things and facilitate the memorization of facts, let's say, for example, and that's going to allow the students to much more quickly and more efficiently retain the information and also retain it for longer. because it's going to be associated to more neurological pathways. And that's what's important here. We're talking about brain-based education. So the neurological pathways that we are creating are what's going to give you access to the information. So if you create more neurological pathways that all land, in the same spot, which is that piece of information that you want to recall, if you have more points of entrance, the faster you'll get there. Because even if for whatever reason you can't really connect with your occipital section of your brain, which is the visual memory, you will recall the sensation, which is a different part of your body. You will recall the scent, right? And those different parts of your brain all together will allow you to reach the information more quickly. Number 6, the brain is a complex and adaptive machine. It grows, it evolves, it develops, it's constantly creating new synapses, it's constantly creating new neurological pathways, and that's just a fact. The brain just simply keeps doing that sort of work over and over again. And even though up until recently we believed that if we were to lose neurons, that they would not be able to how do I put it, to recover and rebuild themselves, we now know that that's not necessarily true, actually. And there's some evidence that we can rebuild and create new neurons even at my age. And I'm 35 years old. And up until recently, people thought that, when you get to like 25 years of age, that's it, you peak. Now it's just downhill. Well, maybe not. Now, number 7 is an acknowledgement of something that is fundamental in human nature. Humans are pattern-seeking machines. And so, if we allow humans in the process of learning to identify patterns, they will much more quickly be able to once again recall information. If we see the pattern, we can see where it's going, and therefore we can see where it came from. So once again, we are using different neurological pathways and different ways to trigger information, this time through patterns. So everything that we perceive in the world is a game of sampling, which we've talked about on this podcast before. The concept of extracting just enough information and then proceed to create a pattern in our heads which explains the gaps. If we can't predict, we will do so. And when we can't predict, we tend to either ignore that information altogether, or we will attempt to process it from scratch. But very quickly, the brain will try to relate that to other information that we might already have, which once again is an attempt to seek patterns. Do I already have information in my head that explains this thing that I'm looking at right now? And if so, I will connect this thing that I'm looking at right now to what I already know from prior. That's a creation of a pattern. Number 8, another very deep human nature based principle. Learning is all about meaning. Our brain is all about meaning. Now we can go deep into this, or we can just scratch the surface. But what is important to understand is that when learning anything at all, let's see, I'm going to give you guys a different example from my personal life. So I practice jiu-jitsu. And one of the things that is really difficult when you start learning jiu-jitsu is that when you're learning certain techniques, you don't know why you're learning them. You don't quite know how they work. They tell you to, grip a sleeve, and you don't quite understand, okay, but what am I doing with that sleeve? That the lack of that why is a blockage to learning. So if then you understand, no, you grip the sleeve because then you're going to create a pulling motion as you create a pushing motion with the other, then You have the why. Oh, I'm trying to throw this person off balance. Gotcha. So the assignment of meaning to every single step of the learning process is a very brain-friendly approach. So remember, the brain develops knowledge on the basis of meaning. Okay? The information itself is irrelevant without the meaning, but the meaning itself is very relevant, even without information. Now, a lot of learning, this being principle number 9, a lot of learning is subconscious. We do a lot of, there's a term used, it's not a very technical term, but I'll use it anyway, phantom practice. So when I was a beginner musician, I was learning how to practice, which is a fundamental skill, and I heard of this concept of phantom practice. And I would think, how can one learn, say, technique by just thinking about it? And the reality is that you can. And now, if you follow sports at all, you've heard athletes talk about visualization. They see themselves do the movements and and they see themselves winning, and they see themselves scoring a goal or whatever. That visualization is precisely that phantom practice, that subconscious learning. A lot of what we do brain-wise is not purely rational and intellectual. The creation of synapses, one of the things that we know is that a lot of those synapses are created and reinforced during our sleep. Well, during our sleep, we are not technically conscious. We are not awake. We're not conscious. We're not aware of the learning. It's happening passively. But it is happening, and that we know. And so remember, if brain-based education is also conscious and subconscious, then we have to allow space for people to go through those subconscious processes, which means do not over practice, do not over study actively. Allow your brain to rest and create the subconscious synapse, or create the synapses in a subconscious state. Now, a bit of a Jungian idea. Principle number 10 is that the brain learns best amongst other brains. Now, we can talk about this at a more social level, say we interact with others, we exchange ideas, we debate, we discuss, we force ourselves to work out an argument for those ideas or against. But there's also something to be said about the collective consciousness, the fact that we learn as a species, the fact that the brain seems to have this ability to sync itself up with other brains at a frequency level, not just from a social standpoint, but once again at a subconscious level. And we know, for example, that the development of empathy has a neurological it comes from a neurological process or mechanism, right? Empathy is an emotional relationship with others, but it is lodged in our brains physically and anatomically. There's some debate whether we do have or don't have so-called mirror neurons, which basically allow us to literally create, imitate others, but from a reflexive standpoint. Here's a perfect example. When someone yawns, you yawn. What is that? Were you gonna yawn? Just pure coincidence? We all know it's not pure coincidence. We all know that this is a thing. With learning, is the same thing. We learn better together. So if you wanna expose yourself to information that is challenging to you, seek out people who are attempting to learn the same thing. Which is why that's the ultimate argument for schooling, proper schooling, right? There are so many issues with schools, but the social aspect is a really positive one. Number 11. The brain doesn't always learn at the same pace or the same way. For example, people have different times of the day when they learn best. Some people are night owls, others are early birds. I'm an early morning guy. It's easier for me to read the book at 7 a.m. than it is for me to read the book even at 7 p.m. That's just my intellectual circadian rhythm, I guess. But it's got to do with my physiological wiring. The way my neurochemicals are released and when, which, by the way, has a lot to do with circadian rhythms. I am also the kind of person who goes to bed early. So that helps, because early in the morning, I'm refreshed, I'm active, I'm alert. So number 11 is quite important because it requires understanding that the brain does not work the same way all the time, at any time, and even depending on what you're dealing with, what you're trying to learn, your brain's going to react differently at different times of the day, for instance. And finally, number 12. Allow yourself to struggle. You cannot have a brain-based experience if you don't understand that the brain is an organ and it needs to be considered as such. It's the organ that is capable of projecting the notion of a mind, consciousness, awareness, self-awareness, self-consciousness. So it's a very complex organ that requires very complex care. You will take the most out of your brain if you understand that what you eat, what you drink, how you sleep, how you think, how you journal or don't journal, all of that comes down to how the brain works. If you want your stomach to work well, you know that you need to eat healthy. Your brain is no different. It needs supplementation. It needs the certain amount of stress. Right? Just like if you want to be fit and healthy, you need to go to the gym and exercise, and you're going to put your body under stress. That's the whole point. Now, you're trying not to injure yourself. It might happen, but that's not the main goal. And that stress is what's going to develop the muscle and the strength. With the brain, it's exactly the same thing. You must expose it to stress. You must demand of it more every day. So, in closing for today's episode, understand that brain-based education is an understanding of the relationship between knowledge and how knowledge is acquired from a psychological standpoint, from a physiological standpoint. Understanding those relationships will allow you to engage with your brain at a much deeper and more efficient level. We will continue discussing these brain-based concepts, tactics, practical things that you can do in your day-to-day life. But for today, I will leave you. But I'm going to ask for you to become more and more aware of how your brain processes information the best. Are you a visual learner? Are you an oral learner? Are you a kinesthetic learner who needs to be doing the thing? Are you a read-write learner? By the way, that's me. You need to take notes. That's me. There's many different ways of learning, but remember, just because you're a visual learner doesn't mean that you can't be a read-write learner. You can be both. You can be all of them. But understand which one is the quickest trigger to be pulled. And then from there, either reinforce that strength, or with all the awareness possible, start putting the other styles of learning, your other styles of learning, the ones that you're not so good at, under some stress. Because you will once again be able to develop more and more neurological pathways. You're going to have a strong, fit brain that is capable of firing synapses at a speed that's going to allow you to access information extremely quickly. Challenge yourself this week by analyzing how you learn. Until then, take care, and if you like this episode, please subscribe, comment, review, etc., etc. I appreciate you all. Bye bye.